la...
Mesdames, Messieurs, bonjour. Je suis très heureux d'avoir l'opportunité de contribuer à cet événement unique qui représente Tech for Retail. Et je vous remercie pour l'invitation d'être avec vous ici. Dans un monde idéal, je vous aurais livré aujourd'hui toutes mes observations en français, attaché comme je suis à cette langue depuis mon enfance. Mais comme vous avez pu le constater, avec mon fort accent, il est sans doute préférable à la fois pour vos oreilles et pour votre sensibilité grammaticale que je poursuis en anglais. Alors, je vous remercie pour votre compréhension et je garde l'espoir intact de maîtriser un jour davantage votre si belle langue. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, I have entitled my comments, and we'll be showing my screen momentarily. I have entitled my comments, World in Peril, the Moment for Radical Regeneration. And I have done it for every good reason, I believe. Our collective challenge, especially in this community, is to innovate our way out of the current multifaceted set of challenges that we face. Together, all of us here need to succeed where other individuals, where other organizations, where other institutions, where other approaches are now falling very short. That implies unleashing what we call a regeneration, a remaking of our objective conditions, our objective circumstances, that is nothing short of radical in nature. So we can begin here now by stipulating as a point of departure that this radical regeneration consists of several critical factors. We need to be thinking about the ongoing geopolitical redefinition that we face. We need to be looking at the whole constellation of economic uncertainties that we're all confronting here day by day. We need to be thinking about a whole range of issues involving the environment that will be highlighted, of course, when the proceedings in Dubai begin. We need to be thinking about complex demographic factors that are at work across the world. And we need to be thinking about political leaderships that are really embattled in one country after the next. The whole notion of governance is being redefined with the forces that we have. To address this constellation of issues, what we need is something nothing short of radical, as I've suggested. This is our moment. Now, we can begin here by stipulating that the world around us is full of peril, is full of complexity. It goes beyond the current geopolitical strife, as horrific and as inhuman as it is. We see it in Ukraine, we see it in the Middle East. It goes beyond the economic headwinds the world ever that persist after the savage pandemic affected all of us in one way or another. It transcends the ever more frequent and chill warning signs that we see about a general degradation of the physical environment. And of course, we'll be hearing a lot more about this as the discussions progress at COP28 in Dubai. And it is straining the capacity of political systems worldwide to address a range of looming challenges, these and others, that are both old and new, that are both familiar and very, very unfamiliar. So what are the contours of this world to come, the world within which you will be navigating in the years ahead? Well, I would suggest that you fasten your seatbelts, because there are 5 critical dimensions of what I believe is ahead of us. We can begin here with number 1. I'm looking over my shoulder, Pascal, because why don't we change seats? I propose we change seats. Number one is this geopolitical reset that I talked about. And I believe that we can begin here by wondering about a shift from what is once called a unipolar world to a multipolar world. I've had a number of great conversations this morning about the world the way it was way back when, the world that has conditioned our lifetimes, our careers, and our organizations. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we had here what Hubert von Rijn called the hyperpuissance phenomenon, the hyperpuissance, the hyperpower phenomenon of Washington. Well, I would argue that that is fading by the day. We can say adieu aux conditions de hyperpuissance going forward. And now we can see in its place the rise of a number of BRICS plus powers. All of us have been watching the remarkable meteoric rise of China over recent years, especially when it joined the global economy after the Deng reforms. But the upshot here is it's been joined by a number of other players. We now are focused on India as the remarkable new entrant to this BRIC power calculus. Now, what's critical across the world, ladies and gentlemen, and I ask you to think about this carefully, is that every single major power across the world has reached a distinctive and significant national inflection point when it comes to defining where they're going. Who here in this audience can say how resolute the U.S. will be with respect to international engagement, especially in light of what is likely to be a very tumultuous debate in the country during the presidential elections next year? Who here can define where things are going in broader Europe, especially after the very savage Russian invasion of Ukraine has forced a reset with respect to security relationships in this region? Who here can define how quickly India will begin to increase its remarkable economic and political influence in the world based on all the figures that we're tracking right now? And who here knows where China will be after the significant economic impediments that have arisen after the lockdown was lifted earlier in the year? All of these countries simultaneously are redefining where they are and where they're going right now. And where this ends up will define the scope and the nature of this reset. Add to that a quick shift in the global military balance, in particular, what's happening in this region with Ukraine, and I would argue in the Asia area, especially South China Sea, with a very significant increase in China's capabilities in terms of strategic nuclear and conventional order of battle issues. Now, where is it all going? Well, I asked you to fasten your seatbelt because I think that we need to be watching for a number of key variables in the future. And this one, I think, is absolutely vital to defining what kind of political direction the world takes and what happens to the outlook for the global economy. It is the course of US-China relations. Have you heard of this? The Thucydides trap. That is the inevitable conflict that in ancient times between an established power and a new power, an emerging power. Will we be seeing that now with the very complex set of relations that are being defined between Washington and Beijing? And then I think we need to be thinking on both sides, how will they deal with growing nationalism, growing populism? We're likely to see a lot of very strong language relative to China during the debate, the political debates in the US next year. And it remains to be seen after the recent summit, the recent discussions between President Biden and President Xi Jinping in San Francisco, remains to be seen how those will be handled in the course of that debate. This political reset is vital. It's not just academic to you, because how these new geopolitical patterns evolve will define commerce in one way or another. It will mean the difference between where you are today and where you are tomorrow. Those of you that can pre-position in this area, especially with respect to U.S.-China relations, will, I think, have a leg up on your competition. Only a few months ago, a global leader said, right now, there are changes the likes of which we haven't seen for 100 years, and we are the ones driving these changes together. Who was the leader? It was Xi Jinping on a state visit to Moscow, saying these words to Vladimir Putin. Now, will he be correct? I don't know. But what I can tell you is that we all need to be vigilant because there are very significant and widening expectations among major powers across the world about where we are and where we'll be going. All right, that's factor number one, Pascal. Let's talk about economic uncertainties. Now, to be sure, we're all watching the short-term outlook and the longer-range issues. And I think we need to begin here by acknowledging that 2024 is going to be rough sledding. It's going to be a tough year ahead. We think that probably the aggregate global economy declined from last year, 2022, at 3.1%. We're estimating a decline to 2.5% this year, and we think it will go down further to about 2% next year in 2025. Well, that hides both good and bad. But I think it can begin here by acknowledging that not only will 2024 be tough, but it will take us some time to revive the economy, to breathe life, to breathe air back into the lungs of the global economy. Our projections at our Global Business Policy Council at Kearney suggest that probably trend growth, that is through the end of the decade, through the year 2030, will be at about average rate per year of 2.6%. Now, that is not something that you should be writing home about. You can compare it with 3.1% for the time span 2010 to 2019, or even more, 3% from the year 1981 to 1991. So we're going to need to build back the momentum that we had prior to the pandemic. And I think I would recommend that you condition your strategies on precisely that issue. Now, this hides, these aggregate figures, hide what is likely to be a significant asymmetry across regions and across countries. And as we look out, all of our forecasts suggest that the Asia-Australasia region will be the piston of growth for global growth through the year 2030, with projected output far exceeding all other areas of the world at about 4% average annual growth. And here I wanted to highlight some of the fastest growing economies that we can expect to see. Our latest projections suggest India at the top with 6.8%, Philippines, then followed by Vietnam, Uganda, Indonesia, Mozambique, Tanzania, China at 4.5%, Ghana, and then Malaysia. This is mostly an Asia story, ladies and gentlemen, that we need to be watching very, very carefully indeed. Now, as we think about the broader international economic context, the one within which you will be navigating in the future, we also need to be very careful of that last point that I raised in talking about the geopolitical context, and that is what is happening between the US and China. And here I can tell you that in the IMF, in the OECD, in a number of other multinational forums, the alarm bells are ringing now about the catchword of fragmentation, the idea of a Game of Thrones economy, international economy, and the rise of what The Economist magazine recently called homeland economics, the more significant repatriation of economic activity across countries. Many of you probably are not keyed into the Trilateral Commission. It is a dinosaur of the 1970s established between US, Europe, and Japan. It's met over the years, but has never been really a significant forum going forward. but they're reviving it now. And it met recently not in the US, not in Europe, not in Japan, but rather in India. And it's held on Chatham House rule, and so there's no attribution. I can't tell you who spoke these words. But one of the key and very significantly respected participants there maintained this. He argued, 3 decades of globalization, integrated, free market-based, and deflationary, the one that shaped our lives, ladies and gentlemen, has been replaced by what will be a multi-decade period of fragmented, not for free market-based, but rather industrial policy-based and structurally inflationary. This year, 2023, he argued, is year 1 of this new global order. Now, is this true? Well, I think we need to be planning on this contingency, and certainly we need to be aware that these are significant potential headwinds that lie in our economic future. Now, those are the economic uncertainties. Now, of course, we're going to be hearing nonstop in the days ahead, immediately ahead of us now, about the deliberations in Dubai. And the fact of the matter is the pressures of the environment are growing by the day. How can you have not read about the ever more alarming reports and data and statistics that are coming out on global warming and a range of other factors? The fact is that global temperatures, at least recorded from November 22nd to late last month, set a new 12-month record exceeding 1.3%. It's not only in a few areas as well, over 170 countries, 99% of the human population had temperatures over 30-year norms. I've been tracking this from the standpoint of planetary boundaries, looking at biosphere integrity, novel entities. A lot of the important scientific work is happening in that area. Biogeochemical flows, climate change, to be sure, will be a big ticket item in Dubai. And finally, land systems and fresh water. This is huge when we think about these boundaries together and how we're falling behind. Recently, a group of scientists declared that we have reached the onset of what they call an Anthropocene era, geological era, in which our impact on humanity is now going to last much longer than recorded history, certainly longer than our mere lifetimes in the whole cycle. I have a little story to tell you about this, and even though this is deadly serious in terms of environment, the story isn't. In Seattle recently, they broke seismic records. Why was that? Because at a Taylor Swift concert, ladies and gentlemen, when she was singing the song Shake It Off, have you heard that? The collective population of the stadium there was jumping simultaneously that it set seismic records, Pascal. They call it the Swift quake for Seattle that occurred. And to me, this was emblematic of how humanity is having an effect on the planet now that we really can no longer ignore. We can't shake it off in the end. And we need to be thinking in clear and crystal clear terms about what we can and should be doing in the future. A Canadian scientist, Michael Mann, an environmental scientist, has written a new book called A Fragile Moment. And every one of you should have this book on your shelf. And among other things, he argues that there's a relatively narrow envelope of variability within which human civilization remains viable. And our survival, he documents over history, depends on conditions remaining in that range. So please, get this book, have a look at it, and think through exactly what these pressures on the environment imply for our collective future. Now, add to that demographic shifts. And here, it's unbelievable to think that we reached last November, a year ago, the 8 billionth human being, Pascal. The UN declared it that it was a young man, a young baby boy born in Dominican Republic. Of course, it could have been anywhere. But in the end, that shows the remarkable exponential growth in demography that all of us have experienced during our lifetimes, growing now at about 1.2 human beings every single second. Now, as we look out to the future, we need to be thinking about where things are going. And the fact of the matter is that even though the absolute level will continue rising to 8.5 billion by the end of this decade, the rate of growth is falling like a rock. If we look at the rate of growth, we now see that probably the end of demographic history will be within our children's or maybe our grandchildren's lifetimes. Between now and then, we need to be watching for the economic implications of growing stratifications, asymmetries that will happen. A gap between high growth populations in some areas of the world and slower growth populations in others. Africa and Asia are on the high growth end, Europe, Americas, Asia, parts of Asia, including China, on the low growth end. On the low growth end, too, we need to be thinking about the depopulation phenomenon that a number of countries face, starting here in Europe, but in a number of other countries as well. Aging overhang affects your markets day by day, a correlation between many of the world's current largest economies and very significant aging populations. White-beard people like me, Pascal, what can I say? Recently in the New York Times, there was a very compelling article by Ross Dutal, who argued that there are two kinds of people in the world, those who are focused on climate change and those that know that it will be the birth dearth, the population bust, the old age of the world will have a significant impact on markets worldwide. I think they're both true in the end, but it's certainly an interesting and provocative point that he raises. And finally, we talk about a fifth area of pressure in terms of this world in peril. We can talk about pressure on political systems. And we can begin by asking about what is happening to democracy across the world. Freedom House, which is an interesting nonprofit, authoritative, respected group in Washington, argues in its Freedom of the World report, which it does every year, is that this year, global freedom declined for the 17th consecutive year. It attributes much of that to the rise of populism, nationalism, protectionism. We see movement toward non-democratic structures in a number of key areas across the world. We'll see what happens now in the experiment in Argentina. There are others as well in Netherlands that we'll see what happens. But what we do know is that 2024, as you think about where you are and where you're going next year, will be a remarkable test for humanity and political systems worldwide. Over 70 countries will have elections, and that's more than half of humanity that will put it to the test in one way or another. And the current issue of The Economist, which often has very wise conclusions with respect to these trends, has pointed out that what sounds like it should be a triumphant year for democracy. After all, half of humanity, looking at this, everything from India to Mexico to my country, well, according to The Economist, rather than being triumphant, it might be the opposite. Pascal, I watch every year the Edelman Trust Barometer. It's released at the World Economic Forum every year, and it's a big survey of popular attitudes in countries across the world. And in their last Trust Barometer, the one that was released at the last annual meeting of the forum in January, they found that only 38% of respondents across 28 countries thought that their governments had a vision of the future that they could believe in. And then they looked at what they call the flip side. 48% believe that their governments do not have a vision for the future that they can believe in. And 62% said that the social fabric that once held their country together, wherever that was in the world, 28 countries, has grown too weak to serve as a foundation for unity and common purpose. We need to be thinking about this and the impact of all of the disparate forces at work that I've tried to outline here. as we think about where things are going. So look, I've made a case, I hope, that the world is going into peril. Now, what can we do about it? What can and should we be doing? I would argue that we need a radical regeneration. We need a systems-wide approach to be thinking about where we are and what we can be doing. And we think that the scope and scale of the response to address this order of magnitude of challenge has to be radical in its very nature. And where else to come to talk about this than the tech and retail worlds in terms of regeneration? You really have, both your worlds, have a demonstrated track record in innovating in ways that other segments of society simply can't hold a candle to. It's really remarkable what you've achieved in terms of frequency and intensity and certainly innovation going forward. That's precisely what we need to take on these big global issues. The fact of the matter is that you are generating a world that is changing by the day. I wrote these figures down. We're looking at something along the lines of an exascale computational world with the new numbers for the fastest supercomputer in the world that just came out. We're working at the exascale, that is a quintillion or 10 to the 18th power calculations per second. I remember, it shows how old I am, working with a national laboratory in the US at the 1 trillion calculation per second level and thinking that was extraordinary. Now that's simply old stuff that you have on your iPhone. We're waiting for a remarkable quantum computing breakthrough that will probably change all of our lives in even more fundamental ways. The estimates for data, your world in terms of data, are growing nearly inconceivably to hundreds of zettabytes by the year 2030. We were talking a little earlier about the world of genetic editing and a whole range of other areas of innovation and science. The fact of the matter is, day by day, we're moving toward a synthetic reality going forward. This is your world. This is how you're defining, leaving your imprint on where we are. And certainly if we can find ways to apply this to the monster problems that appear at the planetary level, we can and should be doing good things. It requires more than just getting the private sector engaged alone, of course. We need to look for creative areas of partnership. ESG is, I think, a down payment here. We can be going much further. So, ladies and gentlemen, I wanted to leave on an upbeat note here to suggest, Pascal, that this really is the moment for groups and communities like yours to be having a significant effect on the direction that our world is taking. It could not be, the moment we are in now could not be more important and more urgent. Je vous remercie pour l'opportunité de me présenter devant vous. Merci, Pascal, and delighted to raise these issues. Thank you.